Esther chapter 3. We're going to pick up where we left off last week. The last verse that we read was verse number 7 last week. In the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots before Haman from day to day, and from month to month to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. And the point with that is that they were casting lots to determine when they were going to destroy the Jews, when this wicked plot of Haman that is described in verse number 6 there should come to pass. And they have determined a day. We saw that last week. That's on down further in the chapter, and I think we're going to get to that today. But what we said last week was this: though this was a day of chance to them, as they appointed a day for the destruction of the Jews, it was in fact an appointed day of God. And we read in Acts chapter 2 how it was the predetermined counsel and foreknowledge of God, according to that they had with wicked hands taken and crucified Christ. And so man can come up with his plans, and he can appoint his day, and he can determine when it will come to pass. And it may seem like a random act of chance to him, but as was it Brother Ed, I think, pointed out that verse in Proverbs that we'd overlooked, that the lot is cast into the lap, but God's the one that determines the outcome. Was it Brother Gary? Yes, thank you, brother. So that is the reality of this, that God is controlling what we refer to as chance. There isn't just happenstance. It is God working out providentially His plans, making sure that that which He has determined will come to pass throughout all eternity. And so we rejoice in that reality that our God reigns. And so we're going to pick up now in verse number 8, and it says, "And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them." The words of Satan are just dripping from Haman's lips in this particular verse, right? What does he do? He paints a half-truth to the king, right? There is a people that is dispersed. You know what? God's people are the salt of the earth. They're sprinkled and dispersed and scattered all across the globe. That certainly was the case for the Jews at this time, as they had gone into captivity, and they were no longer in those individual regions that they had been before, but God had scattered them across the earth as they had fallen under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar and the Chaldeans, and now under the Medes and the Persians. And so that part's true. And indeed, like Haman says here, they are a people whose laws are different. They vary from other people. They're unique in that fashion. They're unique in their laws and their customs. But that last part there, it's not for the king's profit to suffer them. Neither keep they the king's laws. You know how many examples he has of that? One, right? He makes this broad sweeping statement, neither keep they the king's laws. And we've got one instance where one Jew didn't do what the king said. So there's truth to what he's saying, but Satan always paints a half-truth to sell his lie. Listen to what he told Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3. Just from that perspective, think about this for a moment. We know what God's command was. We know the instruction that He gave Adam and Eve. We know the great liberty that they had, and they had just one tree that they couldn't eat of. And so Satan, in his crafty way, begins his dialogue as a serpent with Eve, and he asks the question in verse 1, "Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden?" And so the woman obediently and faithfully repeats the command of God, which trees they were allowed to eat, and the one tree they were not allowed to eat from. If we eat of it or touch it, we will die. The serpent says in verse 4, "Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." Now jump down to verse number 7 and see what happened whenever they ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, of the knowledge of good and evil. And the eyes of them both were what? Open. What does Satan say in verse number 5? "For God does know that in the day you eat thereof, then your eyes shall be open." That's true, right? There's truth in what he says, and you shall be as gods, in the sense that you will know good and evil. And the eyes of them both were open, and they knew that they were naked. They recognized something that they had never understood before, because now they had knowledge of good and evil. So that's true, but Satan always hides the hook in there, right? He told a half-truth. You shall not surely die, but they did, didn't they? They spiritually died that day. They died in their fellowship to God. And death was cast upon the entire generation of men, and yea, the entire earth from that point on. It was a half-truth that Satan used to sell his lie. He's been a master at that from the very beginning. And so that's what he does to Ahasuerus here. They're a unique people. Their laws are diverse and different. They have the Old Testament and all that came from Moses and those things that they're abiding by, that their God has commanded them. And so it's not good. It's not for the king's profit to suffer them, to allow them to continue. But the reality was they were the best kind of people the king could have. The reality is that the Christians are the best type of people that a ruler could have. Only when a ruler demands disobedience to God must they refuse. But in everything else, you know what their attitude and their desire is? Submission. They submit. They do what is right because they're held to a higher standard, not just the standard of the king, but the standard of God. Look at Daniel chapter 6. In Daniel chapter 6, during the times of Darius, or Darius, however you say it, those that were also men of some esteem and power, they were jealous over Daniel and the prestige that he had and the place of authority that he had. It says in verse 1, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was the first. This is one of a few men that we see in Scripture that, as far as the great nation of the world at that time, were made second in command. Joseph, we've been looking at that for several weeks, had that honor. Daniel has that honor here under Darius, and we're going to see that Mordecai ends up having that honor under Ahasuerus at the end of the book. So Daniel was the first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and that the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault. For as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. They're the best kind of people that a ruler could have, right? They don't cheat on their taxes. You know, they're not breaking the city ordinance because they know they can get away with it. They're doing what the law prescribes, right? They're being faithful in that which has been commanded to them. They're being obedient. And they knew as they examined Daniel that there was no fault and there was no error. And he's the most faithful of all the men in the land. He always submits to the command of the king. He lives a life of faithfulness and submission. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel except we find it against him concerning what? The law of his God. This is the one place you're going to have an issue, right? That's the way it ought to be, children. That ought to be the record of us, right? We're not going to find any issue against that individual. We're not going to find any issue against those people except when it comes to the law of their God, to the responsibility that they feel that they have before their God. If we could see all the details and we could pit Mordecai against Haman, you know what we would find? We would find that Mordecai by far had lived in submission to the king. In Haman, we would have seen the same sinful practices that we find in the world, right? It's okay to say a lie here and there if it helps me get ahead, right? It's okay for me to do this. I mean, we see his heart in the way that he plots to just wipe out all the Jews. We see the type of man that he was. Mordecai would have been head and shoulders above Haman when it came to submitting to the king. But I'm going to use his law, the law of his God, his responsibility to his God against him. And on those grounds, I'm going to plot his destruction. Guys, that's what's happening in our day and age. And as things get darker and darker, we're going to see that more and more and more. So go ahead and swallow that down now, right? Go ahead and accept that now. And just understand that's the way it is, that in every age, God's people, this has always been where the rub is, right? I'm going to have to walk in obedience to God, and that means that there are times I'm not going to be able to walk the way that they want me to walk. And we just need to make sure that that's the reason that we're persecuted, right? What glory is it if we take it patiently when we suffer for our faults, right? For our wrongdoing. What's glorious is when in the pattern of Jesus Christ we suffer for doing right. And that was the pattern of Mordecai, who was a pattern of Jesus Christ. And that's the pattern that we ought to be in. God's people live by this rule, Romans 13, and it's good to be reminded of this. When you get that high tax bill, you know, I realized something. We've been at the place that we're at now for 14 years, 15 years, and I finally looked at my tax bill for the first time the other day to see how all that breaks down. And you guys know we're homeschoolers, so, you know, we haven't used all the benefit of the public school and all that stuff. I realized for the first time that 2/3 of my tax bill was to support the public school system. That's fine. That's fine. But where it hurts is whenever you find out that there are different rules for homeschoolers to get things like the Hope Scholarship and things like that than there are for public schoolers, right? And it's like, I paid the same amount of money everybody else did to support that. Romans 13, right? Romans 13 and verse number 5. Forgive me, Lord. I have to repent whenever I read these verses. This is our instruction, this is our rule, this is how we ought to live. Wherefore ye must needs be, verse 5, subject, not only for wrath, not only because you're concerned about the consequences when I disobey what the law said, not just because I'm concerned about those blue lights in my rearview mirror and how that's going to affect my insurance, right? But also for conscience sake. Because even when no one's looking, right? When the world says, I can get away with this and not get caught, because God sees, right? Everything is naked and open before Him with whom we have to do. And so for conscience sake, we must submit. For this cause pay ye tribute also. There's our taxes, right? For they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues. Is this what they require? Then do it without complaining. In fact, do everything without murmurings and disputings, right? Without complaining. Tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So we submit to the king, except in those instances when to submit means to disobey God. And that's exactly how Mordecai lived. And the record of his life is you've had no issues, but now for the first time, right? You've got this one instance. And Haman tells this half-truth to sell his lie to the king. And the people of God are condemned. In verse number 9 of Esther 3, Haman says, if it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I've never noticed this before. This never has stood out to me before. Haman says, I personally will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. Verse number 11 says, and the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, the people also to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. But what verse number 9 seems to be saying is that I will pay this into the king's treasuries to fund this activity. You see that if you jump down, if you skip over to chapter 4 and verse number 7, it says, and Mordecai told him, the servant that Esther sent out to him as he was in sackcloth, when he asked why was he doing this, Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. So Haman said, I'll fund this myself. If you'll let me do it, king, I'll fund it myself. And it's going to be okay because we're going to bring things into the king's treasuries. And the way that they were going to do that is found in chapter 3 and verse number 13. It says, when the letters go out to destroy and to kill the Jews, all of them, look at the very end of that verse, the last phrase, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. So not only will I fund this king, but you know what? We're going to bring in more, right? Because of all the prey that we get from as we destroy this people, that's coming into the king's treasuries. The point is this: Haman funds this big business, signifying he is the originator, and thus he is responsible for this crime against the Lord's people. Though God is sovereign, right? He's sovereign over all things. Sin did not and does not originate with God. God can take wicked hands like we saw in Acts 2, and he can use them to fulfill his purposes. But God is not the author of sin. And he in his sovereignty acts in such a way to where he is not accountable for that sin. He is not responsible for that sin. God simply lets down the wall, lets Satan come in and his kingdom advance for a time, but then he puts the wall back up again whenever they would go beyond that which he had decreed to determine his eternal purposes. Sin originated with Satan. We read it in our very first message on this in Ezekiel 28:14, as we saw. Let's go over there and read that again, because I'm going to misquote it if I don't. Ezekiel 28 and verse number 14. And we saw him speaking of the anointed cherub. This literal King Tyrus, a type of Satan here, and the judgment that would ultimately come upon Satan. He's a type of Satan in his pride and in his rebellion, and then ultimately in his judgment. And verse 14 says, thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. God said, I made you this way. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. You had a seat of glory. You had a seat of prestige among the rest of them. You were set up and you were glorious in your beauty. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created. I didn't do anything bad, right? I didn't create anything wicked in you. You were perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created till iniquity was found in thee. Not till the day that I put iniquity in you, God said, because he didn't author it. Sin started with Satan. Sin found its origination there. This plot stemmed from Haman. He said, I'll fund it. He was fully responsible for that which was going to happen. John 8:44, Jesus said Satan was a murderer from the beginning, right? And when he speaks a lie, what did he say? He speaks of his own because he is a liar and what? The father of it. That's where it came from. That's where it originated from. And so God, in his majesty and his glorious sovereignty, is able to use sin to fulfill his purposes. He will not let it go beyond that which will accomplish what he has determined, but he is at the same time not accountable for that sin. It's like the conversation with the demon that's going to go and cause Ahab to fall, right? Who shall I send to make Ahab fall? And one demon's like, hey, I love to sin, I love to deceive. Why don't you let me go do that? I'll be a spirit in the mouth of his prophets, and Ahab will believe that and he'll go and fall. God says, yes, you will. And I'm going to make sure all the boundaries are removed so that you will succeed in that. He said, you're going to go do it and you're going to be successful. There's God in his sovereignty allowing sin to move forward as it fulfills his will. That ought to comfort us, Christian, because that means that when he says no weapon formed against you shall prosper, he has the power to make good on that promise, right? The evil that's intended, the sin that is intended against the people of the Lord, God will see to it that ultimately it will not prosper. Look at verse number 10 in our chapter. It says, and the king took his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, the people also to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. So I may be about to hurt your feelings this morning. We've seen in this, and it's not a perfect type where you're always, Ahasuerus is not without fault, so he's not a perfect picture of God, but often as we're reading in this text, he is a type of God the Father. And so you say, wait a minute, but the king just delivered the Jews into Haman's hands and said, do whatever pleases you. Whatever you see fit to do, you do it. It might hurt your feelings a little because the king gave Mordecai and the Jews into Haman's hands. But you know what? God will sometimes deliver his own into the hands of the enemy. You know, you're thinking immediately about who I'm thinking about, right? You can't overlook that. But before we go there, I want you to see sometimes why this happens. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 1. 1 Timothy chapter 1. Sometimes this happens because of sin. And this is what Paul is alluding to here as he speaks of two that had rebelled against the truth, that had led some away from the faith. And he says in verse number 20, of whom is Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have delivered unto Satan for what purpose? Y'all there, 1 Timothy 1:20? That they may learn not to blaspheme. So the point in delivering them to Satan is to correct the sin, right? That's our hope. That's what he says over in 1 Corinthians 5, right? When he says this one that has committed this great sin, this sin that's so bad that you don't even find this outside the church and the Gentiles, this manner of adultery, he said we need to deliver this individual to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, right? So that his spirit might be saved. So sometimes those that are the Lord's are turned over to Satan because that sin needs to be dealt with, and that affliction is for their recovery. Were Hymenaeus and Alexander recovered? Were they ultimately the Lord's? I don't know. But the point is, that's a pattern that we find, even with the people of God, that God will deliver them to Satan for the affliction of the flesh, that their soul will be recovered for the benefit of the Spirit. But that's not the only reason. That's the only reason that Job's friends saw. We're reading through Job with the kids right now, and it's the same thing over and over and over again, right? You get to one of his friends, and it's just like, they don't always come right out and say it, but they always talk about how God is against the wicked, you know? And these bad things are going to happen to the wicked, but the people that do right, they're always going to be blessed. And so what's the implication there? Job, you're in a mess. Why? Because you did something really, really bad. That's not always the reason why that God's children are delivered into the hands of the enemy. And so let's look at that at Job chapter 2. Job chapter 2. And this is such a comparable account here, because if you remember what starts all this thing, it starts with the accusation of the enemy. Right? The enemy presenting his falsehood before the Father and instigating these things against Job as God turns him over to Satan. And that's what God says. Look at chapter 2 and verse number 3. And the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil, and still he holdeth fast his integrity. That's what Satan said to start with, right? The reason he's being so good, the reason you can say he's perfect and upright is because you've put this hedge about him. You won't let me get to him, but you let me touch him. You let me take his stuff, and he will curse you. And so God agrees to that in chapter number 1. And what does he say? He says, still, you've done that, Satan. He still holdeth fast his integrity. Chapter 1 ends with, in all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. He holds his integrity, although thou did what? Moved me against him. What did Haman do to Ahasuerus? Moved him against the Jews and Mordecai, right? Although thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause. So this is exactly what we have in the book of Job. And so we know, verse number 1, God delivers Job unto Satan, but he doesn't just do it. Chapter number 1. He doesn't just do it in chapter number 1, does he? Satan says again, he's like, yeah, but that's just because you let me touch his stuff. and his family, but let me touch him, right? Life for life. If you let me touch him, skin for skin, he says in verse number 4, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life, but put forth thine hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face. And what does God say in verse number 6? And the Lord said unto Satan, behold, he is in thine hand. Doesn't that sound like Ahasuerus and Haman? They're yours. Do what you will with them. I've given you authority. I'm going to give you my ring, right? I'm going to give you power over this people. I'm going to give you funds to provide for this slaying that you're intended. Behold, he is thine, but save his life. God will deliver his children into the hands of the enemy. But understand this, right? We know how it ends. Go to Job 42. And let's close with this thought. Go to Job 42 because we're out of time. We know how it ends. And while you're going over there, I'm going to read 1 Peter 5:10. But the God of all grace, who hath called us unto his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after that ye have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish, strengthen, settle you. Now that's not what Satan has in mind, right? He's the thief that wants to steal, kill, and destroy. But what's the purpose of God in this? What's the purpose in Job's life? The purpose of the suffering is that he may make you perfect, establish, strengthen, settle you. And did it work in Job's life? Job said, before God, it was like I had just heard about you with the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. He grew tremendously in his understanding of God through this suffering as he was delivered into the hands of the enemy. And the account that we have of Job when he reached his end is found in verse number 12 of chapter 42. So the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning. And the way that he had to get there, according to verse number 10, was, and the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. You know what his friends were? He said, you're miserable comforters. He said, you're physicians of no value. You know what they did when Job was down and when Job was hurting and when Job was suffering and going, what did I do? They kept him while he was down. That's the kind of friends they were. Guess what he had to do? He had to act just like Jesus Christ and pray for those that put him on that cross, right? Pray for those that were working his harm instead of his good. When he prayed for his friend, when he entered into the fellowship of his sufferings, also the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. When he had learned that lesson, when he had grown spiritually as God had intended from the beginning, his latter end turned out to be better than the beginning. And you know what? That's exactly how it's going to be for the Jews. This thing that it looks like it's their day of destruction and it looks like the day that they're going to be wiped out from off the face of the earth is in fact going to be the day that all the enemies of the Jews are removed. The latter end is better than the beginning. So you know what we need to do? Just trust God who's true to his word. Amen.